this first episode of the ReFi Podcast, we give a little bit of background about ourselves, then move straight into the empirical basis for climate change. Look at what is Web3 and start to unpack ReFi as a term and as a movement, and start to explore why this matters for climate change and why this matters for all of us. I hope you enjoy this initial episode and stay tuned for next week where we're going to drop an interview with a very special guest. I'd love to just step back a little bit because we kind of jumped into the deep end as friends getting into projects right away and just kind of set the stage and hear about you and your background, how you got to this place, and why you wanted to do a ReFi podcast at Toucan.
And likewise, that I'm realizing coming into this conversation, I don't know that much about you. So here's our chance, internet friends that have met once in person to actually kind of get to know each other a bit. I don't even know where to start. I'm from Colorado. I grew up in Colorado, so we have that in common. And I guess kind of the broad strokes are my life is, and the path to here has been a combination of developing a really deep love for the natural environment, mountains and oceans, and exploring the world. Growing up, living in Colorado, going into the mountains with my dad almost every weekend, and doing quite a lot of cycling in my day, a lot of sailing. So this kind of passion to explore and see the world and experience it firsthand. And then in my more, I guess, intellectual path or academic path, I got really interested in, I did my undergraduate in biology and environmental studies and was kind of really excited to dive into how life interacts with the earth, and didn't really get too interested in social systems until a bit later on in my life when I started to realize that people are so important, and the way we organize ourselves and transact value and communicate with each other is kind of the essence of what makes us humans. So my path here, I've had a pretty ranging background in startups, bigger companies. I've worked in the public sector. I've worked for nonprofits and NGOs, and a lot of my work has oriented around this idea of place, of where we are, how we know things about physical environment, spatial and location data. I did a master's in a course called Spatial Data Science and Visualization, which tied all that together. As far as the Web3 path, I'm a proud member of the class of 2017. I fell down the rabbit hole in June that summer when one of my best mates convinced me to buy a little Bitcoin, and then I started asking all the usual questions like, why is this different to other money? And very quickly came across Ethereum and smart contracts, and had this intuition that they would be really powerful without understanding why. Dedicated the next few years to just diving into how they work, what they mean, why do they matter, where are they useful, where are they not useful. And this has brought me here. I'm really so excited to be working at the intersection of these new economic systems and new systems of how we communicate value. I really think of it as communicating value. Money is a communication tool. And then how we can design those tools so that they put care for the earth and all of life on earth right at the center of it, and kind of embed it in the way it works.
Totally.
Anyway, how about you? I mean, I'd love to understand your path here. I know you've got a really deep background in startups. I know you've been really passionate about the climate, at least for a while. I'm curious about what was that sort of climate moment. And then I know you're relatively new to the scene on Web3, but you're making already a huge impact as being this ecosystem champion. And I really want to hear, like, I always love hearing what was the moment where you kind of put together that crypto and Web3 was.
Yeah, man, for sure. Basically, like, I was just bored in school. I didn't really dig sitting in a classroom. I got into the internet and video games, programming, websites pretty early. That was kind of like how I learned. I ended up dropping out of university to start an e-commerce company. It's kind of like Nike ID, what you see is what you get, drag and drop editor. And that really launched me on this path of just learning by either building startups or joining startups. And I've been doing that since, for a long time now. And I really wanted to see how this could be used to make a difference for the most pressing challenges of our time. Not just novel commercial issues to make more money for more shareholders, but like I was really, captivated by the refugee crisis in Europe in 2015 and wanted to do whatever I could to help. And so I actually left the design agency that I had been interning at called Clear Left to go and just see what I could do. And, it's just been this long journey of me experimenting and failing a lot, actually, but sometimes finding the right people and the right methods and succeeding. So I was a part of a startup that was acquired in 2017, and that was a whole host of experiences at OpenGov. I started building social enterprises in the UK here off the back of that in 2018. And really, 2019, upon reading the book, The Uninhabitable Earth, actually on a single flight, it was very random, very happen chance, saw this dead bee on a cover and had always just thought, like, if bees died, like all of them, we'd be screwed. And it just captivated me. And like, I'd kind of neglected to look at the science behind climate change for most of my life for a variety of reasons. But that book really made me look at it in the eye. And I just become a new father, and I read this book from cover to cover in like, a short period of time. And I just closed the book. It was like, this is it. This is the rest of my life. I am doing everything in my power to address climate change in a meaningful way at scale, while hopefully taking care of myself and my family. But I kind of took some time to figure that one out. I kind of ran myself into the ground for the last startup I did, but
it's a prerequisite.
So I stumbled on the crypto thread and sort of DeFi rabbit hole just May of last year, after handing off my startup called Goodery to some co-founders. And I was just looking for a greater point of leverage. And so got into DeFi, was just looking at the space, but really explicitly wanted to see who was doing stuff at scale with climate change. Came up to KlimaDAO. KlimaDAO led me to Toucan, and then Toucan just immediately felt at home. Like the mission of, creating this carbon market in DeFi to finance the best projects on the ground, mitigating and sequestering carbon was just so resonant to me on so many levels. And then, the culture, the people, you and Raf and James and Julia and Rob, like all these beautiful people, just felt like the right place to be. And along the way, I was just like, hey, I want to know everybody else in the space. Like, I'm going to do a podcast. And, you've kindly come alongside, and lots of other amazing people as well. And like, this is the beginning of a new journey of understanding what is ReFi, the regenerative finance movement in crypto.
Totally.
So, I was a fellow at Terra.do just back this fall, which is a 12-week climate change boot camp. So like everything I'm sharing is coming directly from that. And I highly recommend it for anyone who really wants to dive deep and understand climate change on the problem side and the solution side in a very short amount of time, while also building community and relationships. So, the kind of first week at Terra.do, Kamala really introduces this kind of very clear law of thermodynamics to say energy into a system equals energy out. And if you apply this law to the energy coming from the sun and the earth, what you end up with is a kind of temperature in the earth that is really low and very cold and doesn't make sense. And what you learn is that the greenhouse gas effect is really the kind of reason why the earth is able to trap heat from the sun and keep earth at a livable temperature and livable climate. And these particles of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide being the kind of main one, sort of trap heat and bounce it back to the earth, in addition to, white spots in the Arctic and light spots across the Earth, reflecting back sunlight and kind of trying to rebalance the heat that comes in. And so, for millennia, Earth has been a stable climate, which has allowed humanity to build the civilization it has. But what's happening is that the planet is warming at a very alarming rate. And there are many, many different data points which are drawing these same conclusions from, temperature of the ocean, temperature of the Earth's surface, temperature of the air. And we have, historical records from the ice cores, from fossils, and from, other dimensions that allow us to really look back before the human era and even before the industrial era to understand what this was. So, right now we're basically at 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming, and we're seeing all of these catastrophic effects as a result of what seems like a relatively, negligible increase. And we know that CO2 is actually causing this because we've been monitoring this since the 1970s. And actually, ExxonMobil was one of the first organizations to send out shipping tankers monitoring CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. This is a graph from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. This is just one of many data points across the Earth, which is, reading CO2. And as you can see, it's cyclical. It has to do with the plants that are growing and sequestering carbon and doing, the photosynthesis game. And then, the winter months, it being less herbaceous on the Earth. And so what we have here is a rapidly rising temperature on Earth that will result in some very, very terrifying catastrophic impacts. And so we need to reduce CO2 emissions to stabilize the climate and reduce the warming temperature. So there's these kind of various emission pathways that the IPCC AR6 has outlined that shows in order for us to get...
So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC.
Yeah, exactly. In order to get to net zero by 2050, we have to take this really, really steep path where we've been, pushing emissions upwards, and suddenly we have to decarbonize everything and make it drop. But this is actually where we are now. The pledges that countries have announced off the back of the Paris Climate Accord are really sending us to 2.5 to 2.8 degrees warming. So you could imagine that, what Earth would be like, and we can flesh that out at these various scenarios. But these are just the pledges. The actual policies that are in place are sending us to upwards of 3 to 4 degrees warming, which are, are pretty terrifying to look at.
Well, I just want to clarify a couple of things. And my science background makes me want to pull you up on saying numbers, but let's define the units of measurement. So 2.5 degrees warming, what does that mean? That means warming from the average temperature in pre-industrial levels, right?
Exactly.
So before we got this kind of large-scale industrial emissions, kind of human planetary scale emissions, we've got measurements of the temperature in those times. And this is the basis of this this is what you see when the Paris Agreement says 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, thank you. That's a super important tether. So this is just kind of double clicking it, but showing who is contributing to these emissions historically. And you can see very clearly that, the developed world has been a huge driver of these emissions, and now has the, GDP to invest in decarbonizing through renewable energy and other infrastructure. But the developing world still has their emissions going vertical. And so we need to go straight down. And in order to do that, we need some seriously rapid change and to do it at scale. So this is just stepping back. You said that this was quite an important kind of visualization for you.
Yeah. So my aha moment because I remember when I was first year in university, my freshman year, I was arguing with one of my friends whose dad was a climate scientist. And I was just like, how do we know? And also little old us, how can we affect something as big as the Earth and the climate of the Earth? And so again, to kind of pull up on units, what we're really talking about is the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's the proportionate share of the particles in a kind of volume of atmosphere that are molecules that have this warming effect. Carbon dioxide is the primary one. There's a long list of other greenhouse gases that have a strong warming effect. I recently learned, John, that water is one of the biggest one, water vapor. But you hear these sort of, like we're at the highest atmospheric concentrations of CO2 in 100,000 years. 600. This graph is 800,000 years, and I'm like, this is absurd. How can you tell me what the atmospheric concentration of carbon was 200, let alone 500, let alone 100,000 years ago? And then I, in my environmental geology course, studied this French researcher named Petit, J.R. Petit, who went to Antarctica and drilled out these ice cores. So we were learning about how glaciers work and how snow falls and then kind of compacts and falls and compacts and falls and compacts. And you end up with this layered history of each layer kind of is from a year in the past, and air bubbles get trapped in those layers of snow. And so by drilling out these ice cores, you can actually access air that has been trapped in ice for hundreds of thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. And then using kind of chemistry techniques, analyze the atmospheric concentrations. And that's how they create this very detailed graph of the cyclical kind of cycles of atmospheric CO2 concentration.
And you can tell it's going straight up.
Right.
Absolute vertical.
Right.
So yeah, thanks for drawing that history and texture and tethering us to the real world here. And so I think the thing that's really important to understand is that there's sources of sinks, which is primarily, burning fossil fuels and also, other factors, but it's human caused, right? This is humanity emitting greenhouse gases. And fortunately, the planet has, kind of their own mechanisms for taking carbon out, which is plants, but also the ocean. And the problem with rising temperatures is that it sets both of these ecological systems out of balance, such that primarily photosynthesis becomes much, much less efficient and it stops drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And similarly, as the ocean gets more and more CO2 concentration, it becomes acidified and it can absorb less and less carbon dioxide. So every particle of CO2 of a greenhouse gas that gets emitted is, a really legitimate threat to our future survival because it's, drawing all of these systems out of balance. And similarly, there's very clear evidence about the rapid rate by which the ice sheet is melting. And this also has, second order effects. Not only is this increasing the sea levels, but it's also reducing the rate at which these ice caps reflect light and radiation back into the atmosphere. And so it's just compounding this warming effect. And not only that, there's also these sort of methane permafrost layers that are, 64 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide being released as these ice caps melt. And so the kind of impact that we're having already is, 25% of all humanity is facing a water crisis every year, varying ways, as a result of these really, really high temperatures that are peaking in the summer. And this is at, 1.1 to 1.2 degrees warming. We're headed towards 3.5 to 4 degrees warming. And unfortunately, this is also having a devastating impact on the actual nutrients that are being, resulting in staple foods like rice. And so this is resulting in, huge nutrient deficiencies with a forecast of, pretty staggering numbers, around 300 million people being malnourished by 2050. And 1.4 billion women and children having iron deficiency, which is really core and, vital nutrient. So I feel like it's important to understand that like these abstract ideas of carbon dioxide concentration rising and temperature rising have very real world and catastrophic life-threatening effects for huge parts of the earth, and that nobody is going to be spared from this, right? We've seen the refugee crisis of late being caused by a variety of factors, but climate change is just exacerbating this. We're looking at having over 200 million people displaced by 2050, with hotspots across sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and Pacific. And the problem is some of these forecasts are very conservative because it's hard to get somebody like the World Bank to put numbers to paper because they're going to be ridiculed from all sides. There are scenarios where we're looking at, upwards of 1 billion people displaced. And, this is what this model is demonstrating, is that we're, rapidly increasing the band of Earth that is just too hot for human existence. This model is showing that up to 20% would be just completely uninhabitable by 2070 within our lifetime. And, the kind of step back reflection of this is just a symptom of a cause that really is we have built a global capitalist economy that is extractive, and it's sacrificing all of the Earth and its resources to grow GDP, right? I think this is a super important concept to drill home. We have created an economy that is rooted in boundless growth and grows when we extract resources from the Earth. And in order for us to change this crisis, we need to build a regenerative economy that doesn't extract and destroy the Earth. There's a whole host of other issues. We've obviously seen the pandemic era surfacing out of this. Nobody wants another COVID-19 episode. So we should probably look at doing something at scale. And there's a variety of scenarios and pathways, but things get pretty bad if we don't start going to negative emissions in the near term. I think the kind of highlights are to mention that humanity is really shifting to reduce global emissions by 50% before 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. And in order to do that, we have to decarbonize the entire economy and take out fossil fuels. So lots to go through here, pretty heavy, but just wanted to leave some room to touch on this before we shift into the Web3 space of, what are some of the tools that we can use to address this crisis at scale?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that we want to pull up, which is one thing that's important for me is, in a way, this is nobody's fault, right? It's not like this is a kind of, I don't know, in my view, this is not a small group of conniving people that are trying to perpetuate this at the expense of it. This is a emergent property of systems where everybody was, for the most part, doing what they thought was best in that moment. And so while it's probably helpful to understand how we got here, I think casting blame is probably not particularly constructive right now. Well, a big reason why I'm here in ReFi and Web3 is this is a hopeful future and it's inspiring, but I think we should also make sure we talk about this doomerist mindset and how we can help manage our mental health, right? We have to feel like there's hope. And if we just said, okay, all of India is going to become a blistering desert, that's tough to take on board, and it's tough to galvanize action. And then I think the last point is just, and this is what I'm going to keep pulling us up on, right? John and I, in getting to know each other, we've realized we've got this complementing views on these issues, where John wants to go very deep in on ReFi, and I am really interested in looking at the way that these are all interconnected and how our mental health and systems of how we get news and ideas like our geopolitical systems, how all of those relate to this. And so we'll be talking about a broad kind of suite of issues that are all related to it, which in my view is everything, while really focusing in on specifically how people in crypto are innovating to try to essentially find ways in which we can tangibly affect this.
Sure.
And I think one last point, which is just especially grounding, is this is 2030, 2050 for net zero, which means we're not continuing to dump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This isn't even drawing them down, right? So we're still putting out, I don't know, gigatons. How many do you know? Do you know off the top of your head? Gigatons per year?
It says 40 gigatons per year, but we're already doing 52 gigatons. I think we're now close to 55 gigatons. Yeah. So
the way Raf talks about this is good. Is we've got a bathtub, and the more water in the bathtub, I think of the Earth's atmosphere as a blanket, right? And we're essentially just increasing how insulating the blanket is, and by increasing these greenhouse gas concentrations. And so if you kind of take that metaphor to, we've got a bathtub, which is the amount of greenhouse gases we can have in the atmosphere. We've got a tap pouring into it, and we've got a drain drawing out of it. We need to slow down the rate at which we're dumping water into the tub, and also throw the drain open so we can pull down the level in the tub down to a stabilized climate.
Yeah.
And net zero is you've got the same volume coming in as going out. That's not even starting to draw down, and we're already have way overshot what a stable climate looks like. So it's a big job.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about Earth systems is obviously that, you know, they have constructed life to date. And if we can nudge the systems back into a state of equilibrium, you know, life has been predominant, and homeostasis has, you know, been the driving aspect of our climate for a while now. So I appreciate that. And I recognize that, you know, going through this, you know, empirical evidence for climate change is pretty intense and can be kind of grief inducing. But I think it's important actually, because if we don't see reality as it is, we're just going to all continue to behave in ways that isn't representative of the actual state of affairs.
Right.
And so, you know, this is starting to shift gears a little bit to say, yes, anthropogenic, human-caused climate change is real, and it's existential for a huge portion of humanity. And fortunately, all of the solutions are here. You know, the cost of solar, the cost of wind, the cost of generating batteries is rapidly decreasing. And, you know, the use of these decarbonized, you know, non-fossil fuel energy alternatives is accelerating rapidly, but it needs to go faster. And so it's just important for us to recognize that we have the solutions to solve this problem. And frankly, you know, our inability to address this problem so far is just a lack of coordination. And a huge part of this, in my mind, is the nation state structure is just not set up to address these large scale global problems that have long time horizons. The democratic, you know, elective process is in these short cycles. The corporate reporting process is in these quarterly cycles. And when you have a 4-year election cycle and a quarterly, you know, shareholder reporting cycle with everything geared toward a single metric, GDP, which fails to have any account for greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, for biodiversity loss, for human health, for human equality, like you have what we have today. And so the exciting things are emerging, you know, for me in the world of decentralized finance and beyond, that really give an absolute powerful glimmer of hope. And I'm optimistic. I really am. Otherwise I wouldn't be here today.
Totally. Me too. But I think that's definitely also something to really press on this, like this sort of preeminent geopolitical entity right now is the nation state. And the, you know, the sort of game theory there is this sort of, okay, we're in this competitive environment where we're trying to improve our GDP in relation to others' GDPs. And that creates these conditions where it's really, really, like, given that there is no kind of global governance system and enforcement mechanism, why would I as a country tell my citizens to make huge sacrifices for the benefit of everyone when the next door neighbors aren't going to, and they're going to continue to compete against us in order to, you know, surpass us? And that to me, and it actually might serve as a nice segue into this Web3 conversation, because I think of us as like we're transitioning from an international system into a global system. And I think like discerning the difference between those two words and why it matters is pretty helpful. And Web3 blockchains are globally accessible, right? This is a global system of money. And that's kind of simple distinction is actually, to me, like one of the most important and powerful ways in which this is a coordination tool. We have global challenges. We need global coordination tools, and those tools are emerging and presenting themselves like, I guess, not a moment too soon, I'd say.
And so I think there's a couple of things to click on. Like, yes, we're having this global level coordination, but also there's this rapid decentralization process going on, which recognizes that when, you know, small numbers of actors are given huge amounts of power and authority, they often don't act in the interest of everyone, right? And so I think the kind of crypto movement of decentralization, like these networks in themselves work, by decentralizing power and control and then building consensus in a structured way, right? And so I think what we're looking at here is a proliferation of money, which, yes, coordinates capital at a global scale to, sequester carbon into the soil and mitigate future emissions. But it's also, drawing a very strong connection to local communities and giving local communities control over their common land, over the commonwealth of resource that we all need to survive. Clean water, thriving land, clean air, those kinds of things that are integral, which the current economy is just not protecting.
Yeah, I think this is the potential. I think it's also important that we don't take an overly optimistic view. Like, there is hyper centralization in crypto networks.
Yeah,
there are a small number of early movers that have a disproportionate control over these networks. And so that's not to say, decentralization is its own very nuanced fraught topic, which this is going to be a common theme throughout the whole thing. Why don't we, how's climate? I'm impressed, man. 15-minute overview of climate change. Well done. Is there anything else you want to touch on?
No, I think that's good. I think, the last thing to kind of segue into the crypto land is, what people call the tragedy of the commons. And I was fascinated that through my work in crypto, I learned about Eleanor Ostrom, who's done some fantastic work looking at, economic theory about how to protect the commons, right? And in crypto, there's this really, really strong narrative around common goods, public goods, as they're called.
Public goods, yeah.
And figuring out how to coordinate money towards those public goods for the benefit of all. And actually, I think one of the key narratives of the internet is this public good narrative, which is by creating a global network of information exchange that is free and open and accessible to all to participate, both as a creator and a consumer. The things that we create that move the system forward really should be viewed as public goods. And so I'm very interested to look at Web3, which is a kind of buzzword that encapsulates, crypto, blockchain, NFTs, these different coins, this whole basket of technologies from the lens of the evolution of the internet. So I'd love to get your thoughts on how do you see the origin of Web3 throughout history, and what are the key themes that we should surface when looking at how these technologies can be used to address climate change at scale?
Exactly. So, okay, let's start with just the number 3, right? 1, 2, 3. Web 1 was this sort of pretty basic, just I can post things on a server and other people can access them on the internet, right? That and content creation really lived with the people who had, for the most part, the technical knowledge of how to actually kind of host these files and make them accessible to this broader internet. Which, I think of the internet as fundamentally as a communication network, right? It's a machine network of nodes and links, which are computers and wires or kind of signals that transfer data between these computers. And it means that you can send a request to any computer that's on the network, and that request will kind of find its way there. The computer will respond and then potentially send back data. And this is sort of the basis. It came out of actually military research and academic research in the 60s and 70s that were like, hey, I want to share my scientific data with you, and I want to do it over the phone lines, more or less. And then Web 2 is this idea that it's the read-write web, right? Where I could, as a user, update a file or a database on a remote server without necessarily having to host that file myself. And that's sort of the fundamental basis of these social networks, where I go on, I create a record in a database, my Facebook profile, and then I can write my profile and send that message to them, and they basically host that data on their server, and anybody else can look at my profile, and emerging from that is this whole crazy social web, right? And
you get the benefit of being able to create without having technical skills to understand the infrastructure of the internet and hosting and all of that. And so what's emerged is these business models which really capitalize on people's inherent desire to create and monetize their attention. Right. And so it's you can use Facebook for free, but we're going to sell your attention to all the businesses in the world, and you don't know what our source code is. So you don't know what our algorithm is doing to draw your attention and attract it to the right people?
Yeah. So like, I really think of Facebook as like an infrastructure provider, right? Like they provide the servers that allow me to host my profiles and make it accessible to everybody else all the time so that the website's always available. And precisely that, right? By being in a position where they control the infrastructure and us as users are providing this information to these companies all the time, our most intimate details, private messages, financial transactions,
our whole lives,
social graph, our whole lives, they are in a position where they face this principal agent dilemma, right? Where it's like, I have a decision to make where it could benefit me as a user or me as the platform provider. And hey, I got to pay my bill. Like, I don't even blame people for that. Like, that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to draw to say, wow, we've got all this information. Advertising is an established pattern of revenue generation in human society. Like, it makes sense that we would probably start to generate revenue based on people providing this intimate details to us. So that, and again, like, this emerged out of all the best intentions. You look at the early kind of excitement around Google. It's like, get the world's information at your fingertips. Like, it's brilliant. And I really, really like, I definitely have this like sort of surveillance capitalist skepticism and kind of, but I think it's also important not to demonize. Like, everybody has been, I think for the most part, everybody's been doing their best, you know?
So I think there's a couple of things I want to just highlight there. So I think for me, you know, the Web 1, internet enabling people with technical skills to create content, and a new type of business emerges, these online businesses. Web 2, you know, businesses have evolved and allowed other people to create content, to have platforms, and to communicate with the power of the internet without having those technical skills. And another business model emerges. And those business models, the FANGs, you know, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, are really heavily rooted in this Web 2 movement and kind of represent the Web 2 era, have centralized power and, you know, even capital control in a huge way. Like, you know, the FANG block compromises something like 14 to 19% of the US economy at any given point, depending upon the share price. And, you know, there's a lot of negative consequences that emerge from this as a result primarily of this like data aggregation model, which says, you know, you use our platform, Google or Facebook, for free. We sell your information in the form of advertising. We're going to give you the illusion of control, but basically this is how it works. We're going to do everything we can systematically to keep you on this platform, to get you using it so that we can present more and more ads to you. And again, this isn't Facebook or Google's fault. This is just the structure of a corporate entity whose purpose is to deliver profit to shareholders, right? And when you've got brilliant teams of engineers who, you know, can execute these models, what you have is an engine that ends up by nature in a mechanism of, I would say not homeostasis, not symbiosis. I think what we're seeing now is a surface of the attention economy. You know, one of the stats that I'm aware of is that teenage girls who use Instagram routinely are something like 4 times more likely to commit suicide. And this is a really legitimate issue that I have personal experience with. I had 3 good friends kill themselves in high school and 1 ex-girlfriend freshman year of college. These systems are corrosive. These systems are telling people that they are not good enough, and using social pressure through the forms of likes and comments and shares and retweets to keep people on them all the time. And so you know, human reality is effectively being distorted by these Web 2 platforms because of their underlying business models. And the lack of transparency around the source code of like, what is the algorithm that actually harvests people's attention and keeps them here is a, you know, fundamental social issue, which I don't think can be addressed with these current systems. I don't think it can be addressed with these corporate structures. And so I think for me, the most exciting thing about the Web3 movement is the advent of, like you said, the transition of control away from, you know, the corporate entity and shareholder structure towards a user-centric model where the users actually own and control the platform and can see the source code directly and contribute to it. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the kind of Web3 evolution. What are the core building blocks? Again, why does it matter for what we're talking about in climate?
So I think it's really important to talk about the roots of the movement, which go back far before Satoshi and the white paper in 2008, and then the real innovation, which is publishing the Bitcoin source code in January 2009. And it really kind of comes down to this like fringe community on the internet, the cypherpunks and kind of related people, that a lot of them are really characterized by this real deep mistrust for authority, and this belief in the importance that we can communicate privately amongst people without sharing the contents of our messages with intermediaries who happen to be the ones that are routing the messages, and then also down to systems of value exchange, right? Money. And I think like this is probably worth its own whole side tangent, but like, what is the role of a bank or some kind of financial institution? And a lot of times it's just to keep accurate records for us, right? Like it's to maintain. What purpose does the bank serve? Is you give them your money, and when you go check to see that you have the same money you do. And when you want to send it to somebody else, you tell them who you want to send it to, and they reduce your account by that much, and they add that much to their account. Like, functionally, that's kind of the essence of it. But again, especially as we've digitized financial record keeping, these banks are in a position where they have a huge amount of information about the spending habits, like consumption habits of their users. And once again, they're in this principal agent dilemma where they have decisions to make that might benefit them, but that might not benefit their users. And they have to decide the extent to which they're going to essentially sacrifice their own well-being or their own revenues in order to serve the user. And so this all kind of culminates in, over the course of decades, the past couple of decades, people have been trying to figure out how to create a type of money that was purely digital, that didn't rely on a trusted intermediary to hold these records, right? So in the sort of original conception of money, or like kind of what we'd think of some physical object, a gold coin or some kind of bill. And I can go and peer-to-peer give you that money and pay you without needing to rely on anybody. But on the internet, you can't do that, right? Like, we need to have this trusted intermediary that's keeping track of these records and adding and subtracting from accounts and balances when I make that request. And that's how the payment system works. And then in 2009, a computer program was released, Bitcoin 0.1, version 0.1, which when you loaded it up on your computer and started running it, it would establish a connection with this decentralized network of peers that all collectively were playing the role of the record keeper. So, and it would create what's called a consensus network, right? A consensus network that maintains and updates a ledger or database, which is called a blockchain. And it was designed in such a way that any kind of edits to this database, even down to a single bit, were detected using this cryptographic algorithm called hashing, which allows you to very efficiently compare what data you have on different computers. And then I think also a real key component of this is that it essentially, it created an economic incentive for people to play this role and provide the infrastructure needed to host these databases. And it did that by paying them, basically.
Yeah. So yeah, John, I so appreciate you touching on like the emergence of Bitcoin as internet money and talking about this kind of network of consensus. I just want to highlight one of the key insights I had, which is the energy intensivity of Bitcoin is around the consensus mechanism, this proof of work, which is very hardware intensive, very energy intensive. And I was really encouraged to see that that these networks can be used in an environmentally friendly way through a different consensus mechanism called proof of stake, which is something that Ethereum is about to merge into, and other protocols have built as a proof of stake chain from the ground up. And so hopefully anybody who's listening to this with the stumbling block I had, which isn't crypto bad for the planet, can recognize that this technology is rapidly evolving And actually, internet native money is a core element of coordinating capital towards addressing the climate crisis at scale.
Yeah, this is due to the crypto economic design, or based on the crypto economic design of these, right? So in trying to align the incentive of the individual with the well-being of the collective, we need people to come in and put up this hardware to secure the network. And that, in order to make sure that they don't cheat and try to break the system, they have to put capital at risk, right? There has to be some kind of economic incentive for not attacking the system and penalizing or rewarding based on the behavior of the users. And proof of stake consensus mechanism, the security is based on the resources that you have to expend to participate in the network, right? So like spending money on electricity, spending money on fancy hardware, that's a feature. That's not a bug. Like, that's how it works. And the proof of stake model is, it changes the risks people take so that they put economic capital rather than physical capital at risk in order to participate in the network and therefore earn rewards. And it's really, really sophisticated topic. I would recommend, there's an amazing Bankless podcast actually with Justin Drake, who is a researcher at Ethereum, who goes into proof of stake and the ways in which it's not only a more secure model, but also obviously just orders of magnitude lower resource consumption.
Yeah, 99.95% more efficient than proof of work.
But you're right to hit on this, John. Like, this is sort of one of those hangups that if you can look past this perceptions of the negative environmental, but not even perceptions, like there is negative environmental impact to proof of work networks. But if we can look past that and see the value of these global coordination tools and appreciate that the ecosystem is moving to radically more efficient security models, then we can start experimenting with exactly, wow, what happens when we can program money, when we can program incentives, when we can do this on a global scale, when anybody can get an account just by downloading an app on their phone.
So cool.
And that I really feel like we need to be anticipating for this future. And well, it's here, but building towards that and kind of memeing into existence the rejection of proof of work networks, while also leaning in on innovating and really seeing how these global coordination tools can be useful.
Awesome. John, thanks so much. I just want to take a quick break for our sponsors. Super grateful to Toucan Protocol for giving us an opportunity to explore this ReFi movement. Toucan is building carbon markets in DeFi to enable builders to build with carbon as a money Lego, and ultimately to finance the best climate action projects on the ground, sequestering and mitigating carbon. So if you're interested in building planet positive protocols, check out toucan.earth. And additionally, so grateful to Bankless.do Consulting, who's helping us produce this podcast and market it and get it out there. Bankless.do Consulting's emerged out of Bankless.do, which is the DAO arm of Bankless HQ. One of the ways that I got into crypto was through Bankless. If you're interested in creating high quality media content about DeFi and beyond, check out Bankless.do and get in touch with their consulting team.
Okay, so this Web3 movement really kind of, its genesis started with Bitcoin, I'd say, and that's created the first public blockchain or open blockchain. And I guess I really think of Web3 as a universe which has a bunch of different galaxies in it. And the essence of this to me is that the values and principles that go into kind of building technologies that sit in this all are oriented around a couple of key principles. One of them is this idea of don't trust to verify, that there need to be ways for different participants in the system to verify that things are true, that people haven't been messing with stuff, that someone hasn't been abusing their power. Another one is that it really has to do with this concept of cryptoeconomics, which to me, the essence of cryptoeconomics is aligning the individual's self-interest with the collective well-being. So me pursuing my own rational course of action is going to promote the health of the whole. But it's a pretty wide-ranging field, and a lot of people kind of think, okay, Web3 equals blockchains. And I think that's a bit limiting. I think we also need to think about self-sovereign identity and this idea that I, as an individual, can control my digital identity and I can port it with me across the internet rather than being locked in and only having access to my identity details on a particular siloed platform. There's this really exciting, Bitcoin was sort of this digital money. And then a couple years later, on the insights of a very brilliant Russian-Canadian programmer called Vitalik Buterin, essentially the insight was we could create more sophisticated computer programs and store it on this network and run it on this network that aren't accessible to Bitcoin because of the way that Bitcoin is designed. And you spend a while trying to get Bitcoin to adapt how it would work, the Bitcoin community to adapt, and they wouldn't go for it. So he went on to create this new blockchain, which is called Ethereum, and a new protocol. And these small computer programs that you can host and run on a blockchain are called smart contracts. And this is like probably one of the most powerful innovations in human coordination tools in history. Smart contracts are, as I say, they're small computer programs that can own money. They are stored on a blockchain and executed by this consensus network. And they form the basis of many crypto tokens. NFTs are stored in smart contracts or run on smart contracts. DAOs run on smart contracts. Decentralized autonomous organizations use smart contracts to collectively govern and manage funds and other assets. So this is its own kind of huge field of innovation, like vein of exciting development in Web3 that were unlocked from the fact that Bitcoin was open, right? Like Bitcoin's open source, so people could look at that, understand it, and then figure out if and how they wanted to slightly modify it.
And this idea of a smart contract is parallel to the idea of a web page, right? In the same way that a web page pioneered this whole new world of innovation, smart contracts is this kind of key building block that has been extended to mean you can create, different coins and different tokens, and then, NFTs of these non-fungible tokens that have this kind of uniqueness about them. And there's a really powerful idea here of just stepping back from this sea of noise, which is happening in Web3. There's a lot of noise, but looking at the underlying building blocks of innovation. And what we have here are these kind of computer systems that run on top of a decentralized blockchain network that can allow us to redesign money and redesign the incentives around how people interact with money. And not only that, but to begin to do that with anchors to real world physical events. And when you can then begin, which we're seeing now in ReFi, to bring in real world positive or negative impacts, such as, sequestering a ton of carbon dioxide in the soil, or such as, increasing biodiversity, or planting a tree, or even cutting down a forest. These are real world events that have tangible and significant impacts on the future of humanity as a result of, our climate. And so the smart contract layer that Ethereum pioneered has obviously been expounded upon by others like Polkadot and Solana and Cardano and lots of others, but it's important that we have these new tools for coordinating human energy and human effort that don't need the input of banks or nation states. And actually, this world of redesigning money to build a regenerative economy, to me, has one of the greatest potentials to accelerate climate action at the scale that we need to survive and to really circumvent the worst impacts of the climate crisis.
Yeah, agreed. Well, that's probably, we will be pulling up concepts fundamental to Web3, I think, throughout the course of these conversations. But it feels to me like we should dive in and kind of really go have a look at what this nascent movement of ReFi is and what you're seeing through your ecosystem advocacy efforts, and just kind of get a little bit of a preview of some of the topics we're going to be covering in the next several conversations we have.
Yeah, definitely. So when I started building that climate crypto.xyz directory site, I just wanted to understand who was doing what, who was doing meaningful climate impact in crypto, and specifically kind of looking at the decentralized finance side of crypto, the like open source money Lego block side of crypto, right? There's lots of different kind of cultures in crypto emerging, but I wanted to know who was taking this kind of Uniswap style, Aave style approach to building financial systems that are addressing climate change. And in building that list, I started noticing that there were a couple patterns and a couple trends emerging. And I started writing this long form article called What is ReFi that really experiments with this 3-pillar model for giving some structure and shape for the ReFi movement. And I don't know who coined the term ReFi, whether it was Raf from Toucan or Gregory from Regen Network or somebody else, but ReFi is kind of taking the DeFi wink, but adding a regenerative, focus to it. And so the 3 pillars in ReFi that I see emerging are: 1, initiatives that are trying to stabilize the climate. And this is very centered right now upon carbon, the carbon market in particular. And this is getting a lot of growth. KlimaDAO reaching $1 billion market cap in less than 2 weeks upon launch with Toucan. That to me is, a pretty special moment, showing that humanity's ready to look at carbon as a new form of money, as a new form of value capture and a new form of exchange. And that's kind of one of the key things in this first pillar of stabilize the climate. But I think if you look into the climate science and you look deeper, carbon is kind of a poor proxy for planetary health and ecosystem health as a whole. And so the second pillar of, cultivating biodiversity and restoring biodiversity where it was lost and destroyed is really important. And I see it more as an evolution upon this initial focus of stabilizing the carbon market or stabilizing the climate using carbon markets. And the idea behind the second pillar is just that humanity or people are an element in a very complex ecosystem of life on Earth, and that we depend upon lots of other, life forms for our survival and lots of other natural resources. And if you walk into a forest that hasn't been cut down and has been thriving for millennia, you'll see thousands of different species of life that are working together to perform different functions. And one of the outcomes of these systems are that they sequester carbon naturally, and they support the evolution of other life forms. And it's a really positive homeostatic environment. And so the second pillar of looking to restore biodiversity is probably a more mature look at how we address climate change. It's not just about a scientific reductionism of greenhouse gases and, capital flows. This is looking at, how can we restore the balance of life on Earth and get ecosystems moving in a healthy direction. And then the last pillar 3, I've been toying with calling Institute Justice, but this is really looking at the human system, the human organizations, the human welfare, the human well-being side of planetary health, right? We are an organism on Earth, and we've self-organized into different nation states, into different regions, into different entities, and we have, different historical identities. And unfortunately, our current system has resulted in a vast, uneven distribution of wealth, uneven distribution of opportunity, and quality of life. And for me, instituting justice is about looking at what it is that has driven us to this place and figuring out if we can create economic systems that not only stabilize the climate, not only restore biodiversity, but also build caring communities that take care of each other and look after the marginalized and the poor and redistribute opportunity and redistribute power and redistribute responsibility towards the many instead of the few. And so those 3 pillars are something I've been playing with to make sense of ReFi myself. But I'm curious to hear what you think as I put those out there in the context of what you know. John, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful framework, and I think the first 2 build on each other to point towards the fact that this is a complex system, and if we were to take this, I guess you say, reductionist approach and just think about carbon, then we're going to miss a trick. And we could optimize for reducing carbon and realize we kind of missed the forest for the trees. And I think, we'll definitely want to dig in, but the way that I've kind of learned about it is this idea of planetary boundaries, right? There are several different environmental boundaries that the Earth kind of, for systemic processes on the Earth to continue in a healthy way, in a kind of homeostatic way, as you say, they have to be respected. And I think we're overshooting most of these boundaries. Sure. One of them being atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations.
Yeah, and Kate Raworth's Donut Economics is a really fantastic model for understanding these kind of planetary boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. The ecological ceiling, exactly. Ocean acidification, chemical pollution, the nitrogen cycle, land conversion and land use planning. Biodiversity is one of those. And I think, understanding the key leverage points and we got to kind of break this up into pieces, but I think looking at this holistically is where we will end up, while kind of going through and examining each one of these boundaries and how we can use these tools to address them and help kind of transition so we're living within those edges. And then I think, on the institute justice side, I think this is so important. And I think we need to acknowledge, we're two white boys that are from, like you say, suburban Colorado. We have quite a constrained view. And I'm aware of this. I know you're aware of this based on our conversations, and this is a point where I think we have so much more to learn than to say, right? We've got a lot of listening to do, and I'm hoping that we can bring on some people that can share their perspectives from some of the less represented communities, so that we can surface those voices and learn for our own sake, but also amplify and use this as a platform for everyone to get a bit of a better grasp of how we can create an economic system that redistributes power from the core and make sure that all people are taken care of. This is really, I think, a issue of human dignity. And if we don't have that, then people are driven to these desperation and kind of acting out of scarcity, which causes fear and violence. And
So I think the interesting thing for me as we look at stabilizing the climate is just to touch on some of the protocols that really seem to have been making progress here. And as we see the evolution of the internet, we're also seeing the evolution of money. And with the likes of Bitcoin and Ethereum, we've got new forms of communicating value and coordinating capital to different places. And with the rise of Toucan Protocol and KlimaDAO, we have now this really core money Lego, which is highly liquid carbon on a blockchain network, which has many benefits. And when I say highly liquid, I mean, it's in large supply. You can buy lots of it or you can sell lots of it. And the market is large enough and deep enough to facilitate that exchange. And when I say in DeFi, I mean that you don't need any centralized financial intermediaries. You've got these protocols like SushiSwap and Uniswap who automatically make these deals and these transactions for people on a kind of algorithmic basis. And so this concept of taking the world's entire supply of carbon and putting it on an open blockchain for anybody to see is really, really critical for reducing all of Earth's emissions at a rapid rate. And I want to just unpack this in a few ways, because I think it's important for people to understand what the carbon market is and what its weaknesses are, but also the role that it could play in this large scale, human coordination of capital to address climate change. So I'd love to unpick that in the first pillar a little bit and just kind of walk through it. So, the first thing to say is that a carbon credit is the kind of unit of account. And we do that in 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And there are people all around the world we are all emitting carbon dioxide through activities, and there are various, accounting practices which help us understand if we, eat one steak every Friday for a year, how many tons of CO2 is that going to result in? And it's a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science, because it's quite hard to track all of the different scopes of emissions. But we're improving our ability to understand how many tons of carbon dioxide or equivalent greenhouse gases are emitted through various activities. And this is a really core part of humanity's, evolution of understanding how to live within these planetary boundaries, is to accurately account for greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's on like the emissions and the source of carbon dioxide emission side. But then there's different activities that we can do as people to sequester carbon into the soil and into other places, like rock.
Pull it out of the atmosphere.
To pull it out of the atmosphere. And, one of the commonly known things is planting trees, right? But you can also prevent trees from getting cut down that are mature.
Yeah.
And so carbon credits are an attempt to create a connection between polluters of greenhouse gases and sequesters or sinks of greenhouse gases. And by creating a carbon credit that's issued by a verification body like Verra or Gold Standard, you create trust between these two entities. Taking a Microsoft in Seattle who's emitting and a tree planter in Madagascar who's sequestering, Verra acts as this trust-creating layer to issue a carbon credit to the project owner who's planting trees, such that they can sell it to a Microsoft. And Microsoft can then claim that on their carbon balance sheet, so to speak. And so as humanity is making these public net zero commitments, Microsoft has a net zero commitment, Google, Facebook, all these huge polluters are saying, we're going to go net zero by this date. The carbon market is one of the primary mechanisms that they're going to use in order to fulfill on those commitments. So I just wanted to hold that space and unpack that a little with you before we go on to the other pillars.
Yeah, it's something it's quite abstract, but it's really helpful to understand. I think of a carbon credit as essentially it's like a results-based financial instrument, right? So it's the unit of account. It represents 1 ton of carbon that's not in the atmosphere. And it's issued by these standards bodies that have developed a methodology for analyzing how much carbon a project has sequestered or some action has avoided being emitted into the atmosphere.
Mitigated,
so I think exactly. So I think of that as like you've got the tap flowing in and the drain flowing out. Avoided emissions is turning down the tap, and sequestered emissions is opening the drain and pulling it out of the bathtub.
Totally.
And so on the back of these actions, these systems for monitoring, reporting, and verification, what they call MRV, they go and they assess, okay, this forest has pulled 1,000 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere because it's grown this much in the last year. Therefore, the forest people who are managing the forest get 1,000 carbon credits, and they can sell them to the market, which is this. It's almost like a retroactive funding mechanism for having done the work.
Yes,
that
it is retroactive.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I think a point on like, to date, the only use case for carbon credits as an end user is for polluters who want to cancel out their carbon emissions with negative carbon emissions and kind of claim net neutrality, right?
But it's also to incentivize people to plant trees and invest in renewable energy as an alternative, right? So it's both sides.
But yeah, exactly. So on the demand side, the end use demand is from polluters, and the idea is as the price of these carbon credits goes up, that's a signal to the supply side that they should produce more of them. And if you only produce carbon credits by planting trees or doing other things that reduce carbon in the atmosphere, then more of these projects are going to come online because they're profitable. And one thing that's very exciting about plugging this into this wild and wonderful world of decentralized finance is there's a whole bunch of other sources of demand for these value units than just polluters.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's the carbon as collateral, carbon as a building block, carbon.
Yeah.
So yeah,
totally. And so I just want to touch on that briefly to say that the carbon market as it stands today is fraught with issues. but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it to incentivize people to plant trees and use renewable energy instead, and that we shouldn't use it to help companies fulfill net zero commitments. What it means to me is that we need to address those issues systematically as fast as we possibly can. So one of the issues is obviously known as double accounting, and that's when a carbon credit is issued and then effectively used twice to offset emissions in two places. And the problem with this is multiple. So the first is that the human kind of narrative of net zero is predicated on the idea that 1 ton of carbon dioxide emitted plus 1 ton of carbon dioxide sequestered at a later date equals 0 tons of carbon dioxide. But the scientific consensus is that this actually isn't right, and that what ends up happening is there's what's called the net positive forcing effect, meaning the temperature's still going to get a little bit warmer as a result of those two things happening together. And so this, to me, is a kind of key thing for us to understand. But it gets even worse when Microsoft claims offset A on their balance sheet, and somehow, as a result of not having an open and transparent public market, so does random company in Texas claims offset A against their balance sheet. And everybody thinks, hooray, we're moving in the right direction. But in reality, we're not. And so part of this problem is that these verification bodies and these registries aren't set up to solve this double accounting problem. And the people in the middle, who are the brokers who are exchanging these carbon credits between people planting trees and people polluting, are, again, not held accountable to a system that, can see very clearly if things are being counted twice. And so there are, rampant stories of carbon credits being sold and offset and accounted for on, these net zero commitments 4 times at large scale. And you look anywhere and it's like a recycled house of cards. My friend Nirvan has written a good article that we can link to in the show notes that talks about this. And so one of the key things that, blockchain has in favor is the ability to prevent this double accounting from happening, and to ensure that a carbon credit that's issued is only offset once, and that we can track its life cycle throughout the period. And that in itself is probably the best use case, in my opinion, for blockchain to date on a very real world, practical global scale. So that's kind of the issue with the carbon market. The other is that carbon, in effect, can only be used as an offset, but actually it is an asset, right? And so if we can begin to allow people to buy carbon as an asset and hold it, but not claim it as an offset, what we enable is price discovery through speculation, which allows other actors besides polluters to buy carbon credits and to finance projects who are sequestering and mitigating future emissions. And that is a really important dimension that, again, we're seeing emerge in DeFi. And so those are some of the issues in the space. But the last one I'll surface is the relationship between private entities like a corporation and then national entities. So currently nation states are going to these COP events, COP26 in Glasgow is the most recent, and making nationally determined contributions towards this net zero by 2050 goal. And so, these are things that nobody is holding them accountable for. They're saying we're going to reach, net zero by 2060 or by 2035, whoever it is. No one's holding them accountable. There's no standard accounting procedure for this. And so nobody knows. We have to trust nation states to act in good faith and to report upon these commitments, which in itself to me is just, a laughing matter. And I have a good friend, Ben Margolis, who's director of the Climate Coalition in the UK. And this is the state of affairs, right? And so a public ledger upon which these nationally determined contributions can be accounted for and, audited is absolutely imperative. To make sure that all of humanity is driving to net zero at the rate we need to prevent, cataclysmic, systemic ecological collapse. And so there's that piece at a nation state level. But what's even worse is that those nations make those commitments, but then take the carbon credits that are issued at a project level as a part of their nationally determined contributions. And the company Microsoft is already claiming that on its balance sheet, right? So you're getting this double accounting mechanism at a corporate level, at a private level, and then at a nation state level. And what really needs to happen is we need to be clear that nation states need to be driving these net zero initiatives in their own right, as do corporate entities, and those sequestered volumes of carbon should be accounted separately. And I think that's a really key idea to get in place, that there should be a very clear global carbon market with full transparency and citizen assembly-led accountability to hold both corporate actors and national actors accountable for their commitments, because all of humanity's future depends upon it.
I think there's one other challenge with the voluntary carbon markets that we should highlight, which is the fact that it's very fragmented in as much as carbon credits are stored on registries, right? So this is I think of this as like an Excel table.
Yeah, and just before you go into that, the voluntary carbon market is companies like Microsoft voluntarily making net zero pledges and fulfilling. And then the compliance markets are these kind of nation state or supra-nation state facilitated carbon markets driven often by NDCs, but often in relation to cap and trade systems. So yeah, the voluntary carbon market is highly fractured, as you've said.
Yeah, the compliance markets work a bit differently. Most of what we've been talking about here is voluntary carbon markets, and that's really the tokenized positive externality of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But as far as the fragmentation goes, right, so you've got these different bodies, standard setting bodies, which essentially establish and create these methodologies for, okay, here's how we are going to assess whether or not a project has reduced or removed an amount of carbon from the atmosphere. And that's going to be used as the basis of verifying this positive impact. And that's the basis for us issuing these credits. Okay, then where do they issue the credits, right? Okay, so they actually keep these ledgers themselves. They keep these registries themselves, and it's this database that they maintain, and they will add a line to the database saying, cool, this year this project created this many carbon credits and we're going to give it to this person, and then they can sell and transfer control on their ledger. But there's a bunch of different standards bodies, and they're not harmonized, right? There's no way to compare and transfer and easily kind of interoperate a carbon credit from one registry with another one, Verra, Gold Standard, Plan Vivo, etc. So the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets has proposed this concept of the Meta Registry. I don't know if they originated it, but they've been talking about this idea of the Meta Registry, which is, I envision it as like the registry that sits above all the other registries and can hold carbon credits from a bunch of different places on one registry where they're standardized and interoperable. That means they're kind of tagged with a common set of attributes, and they can be, it's in a standardized format.
For auditing purposes and all of that.
Yeah. And that's, I think, another very powerful use case for public blockchains is creating this meta registry where you can kind of upload or transfer your credits from wherever onto this meta registry, which means it can play in this much more liquid, deep pool with all the other credits.
Which also builds trust with corporations to say that we're happy to put more money towards offsetting carbon because we can trust that it's going to the right place and we can report on it, right? And so I think that's why I'm so excited to talk to Raf and James from Toucan about this meta registry vision, because a lot of people in crypto have tokenized carbon in the past, but they haven't done it in a way that really understands the nuances of the voluntary carbon market and these shortcomings that we've described. I think the core innovation that we've seen with Toucan is the ability to create this meta registry with an architecture that makes sense for the voluntary carbon market. And so I think this is a really fundamental building block in humanity's ability to move money to tree planters and to tax effectively through a voluntary tax polluters for emitting greenhouse gases. So so appreciate you raising that meta registry concept. I think I'd like to kind of move on from the carbon market thing with just a quick recap to say, in my mind, ReFi has been very catalyzed around stabilizing the climate using carbon markets. And I think we will see a lot of attention and capital and activity in this space for the next, foreseeable future, but that there's a nuanced evolution emerging around biodiversity. And this is actually something I know much less about. And I'm sure it'd be great to have somebody on the show like Neil Spackman, who's looking at this on the ground. But in essence, in the same way that humanity is issuing a credit for a project on the ground planting a forest for a certain number of tons of carbon dioxide that they've pulled out of the atmosphere and sequestered in the soil, there are registry bodies like Plan Vivo who are issuing a biodiversity credit to projects who are cultivating biodiversity through a variety of means. And I don't want to go into depth on that, but I think it's really important to understand that humanity needs diverse ecosystems to survive, and that we are in what scientists are calling the sixth mass extinction caused by human activity. The statistic I read most recently was that we have destroyed 50% of life forms on Earth over the last 40 years. 50% of biodiversity has been lost. And we're looking at a rapid increase in biodiversity loss over the next 40 years, resulting in a very, very unstable ecological climate with a very small number of species that survive. And I don't know the relationship between this kind of stuff in the sort of zoonotic era, but suffice to say that I really am excited to see, toucan-style initiatives coordinating capital flows to people on the ground cultivating biodiversity, because I personally believe it's essential to human survival. What are your thoughts on that side, the second pillar?
Yeah, I mean, we are organisms that live in an ecology, right? Like, we occupy a niche in an ecosystem, and that typically, at least historically, I mean, this idea that nature exists in homeostasis it depends on what scale you're looking at, right? Like, a new species could move into an ecosystem and completely mess stuff up for a long time, and then eventually it will stabilize. And I think we kind of have to recognize that in a lot of ways we're kind of playing the role of that invasive species for the whole planet. Where as humanity, the human population has scaled and we've expanded our territory around the world and kind of settled. Yeah,
directly coincides with mass extinctions. Like, that's clear. Read Sapiens.
Yeah, right. But yeah, I think so. Just kind of understanding that we are part of this ecosystem, and that a healthy ecosystem is one that's biodiverse. It's a nuanced thing, but I definitely agree that. I mean, there's no question that as this biodiversity degrades and more species go extinct or eradicated from ecosystems, it's going to have unforeseen emergent effects.
Yeah,
and
on the climate,
reach these tipping points on the climate. Yeah,
and that's where I think the ocean begins to be an interesting space to look at this. We talked about the carbon market in the context of forests, but specifically in the ocean, whales and phytoplankton and these different living organisms exist in the kind of oceanic ecosystem in a balance that we've disrupted from a variety of levels. One, by putting plastic into the ocean at unconscionable scale, and two, by overfishing and fishing in a way that just destroys coral reefs and trawls the bottom of seabeds and just doesn't have regard for these living systems. And I won't dive into the kind of nuances of science here because, frankly, I don't understand it fully, but I'd love to speak with somebody. I know Louise Boriani is doing some amazing work at Collectivo and Curve Labs, looking at this space of how you can begin to use things like NFTs and smart contracts to track these oceanic ecosystems from a carbon perspective and from a biodiversity perspective. There's really key kind of seaweed that play very important roles in sequestering carbon. that I'll let Louise dive into. We can now use NFTs to be able to coordinate capital to protect these things, and ultimately make it cool to care about the earth and to be a steward of specific ecosystems. And I think that's the thing that's really emerging off the back of all of this work in Web3 is culture is changing. Art is changing, music is changing, human expression is changing to be very concerned with this crisis. And that represents an evolution in human consciousness about who we are and, what status looks like. And so I think that's one of the things I'm super excited to see unfold is, how this profile picture movement in Twitter sparked by CryptoPunks and Bored Ape Yacht Club can be applied towards, scaling large scale, tree planting, large scale biodiversity protection, and all of that. So we'll touch on that before we close off on the Institute Justice pillar and wrap up for the episode.
Yeah, I think the essence here for me is we need to make this incredibly rapid transition in the way our entire society works and then reach kind of a stable, sustainable state of being as a species. And probably some of the most powerful tools we have to do this lie with the financial system. And so basically we need to point the financial system at climate change. And as we get deeper in Web3 and we kind of watch as this internet native parallel financial system rises and gains acceptance and develops in its utility and is increasingly integrated with the legacy financial system, this seems like this almost like skunk works, high risk, high reward. If this works and these crypto networks continue to scale, this is where a real kind of force multiplier opportunity for impact lies, is pointing the Web3 financial system, the decentralized or regenerative financial system at climate change. And so that's what this is about for me, is like really burrowing in to understand how we can innovate with how money works and how finance works to make sure that we make this shift and then embed care for the earth in the system,
new
of
system
value exchange that society depends on. Exactly.
And this is really working upon the kind of Einstein quote that like, you can't use the same mental model to solve a problem as the mental model that created it. And it's the kind of similar idea of Buckminster, I think it's Buckminster Fuller, about, don't fight the existing system, make a new model that makes the old system obsolete. And this is really what we're doing in DeFi for money as a whole, but also in ReFi for climate change. And I think everybody on Earth who knows anything about climate change is sick and tired of watching nation states fail to make significant contributions and then fail to uphold them. And so the movement of ReFi is really harnessing this intense desire for humanity to act now. And so, we can't unpack the Institute Justice at great length in this. I don't think we're seeing too many protocols in this space, but I think there's massive opportunity here. Talking to somebody called Courtney from a startup called Well Money out of Ideas 42 Ventures that's looking at this. I just want to kind of, I guess have a call to arms that says, if anybody here listening is intrigued by what's happening in Web3 and you're tired of waiting for nation states to do something, get involved. Like there are so many ways that you can apply your effort, your energy, your money to have a real meaningful impact at scale. Like Toucan has tokenized almost 5% of the entire Meta Registry in just in just a few weeks or just a couple months. This is really massive scalable impact happening here, and we need as many people as possible to kind of move away from this notion that crypto is bad for the planet and actually realize this is one of the core tools that we need to survive on Earth.
Yeah, the Einstein quote reminds me of Audre Lorde. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And it really feels like we have a new tool set and we're just kind of together discovering how they can be used. And the nature of these communities is that they're open and inviting, and anybody can jump in and help. And So I just want to echo that, like, come along, say hi. We would love to have you and help figure out where you can fit and create the most value.
Absolutely. Yeah. John, it's been an amazing journey today. We've gone through a lot of spaces. We have touched on both of our backgrounds. We've looked at, the empirical basis for climate change. We looked at the evolution of Web3. We looked at the emergence of the regenerative finance movement in DeFi, which we are affectionately calling ReFi. We've gone pretty deep into carbon markets, touched on biodiversity, and know that we need to look at the social systems underpinning all of this. And yeah, it's been a real space here today. Thank you, man, for being here. It's been a real pleasure, and look forward to chatting you again next week with our first guest.
Likewise, John. Thank you. There's so much to unpack, and I think anybody who claims to understand all of this is kidding themselves and you. And so I'm really excited to just kind of take this beginner's attitude towards this and ask some of these questions and really kind of get to the essence of this, so that we can all just have a better grasp of what's at stake, and really like that solar punk ethos of we reject this doomerism. Like, we are embracing a hopeful, optimistic future. We know we can create a beautiful garden for future humans to enjoy, and that's what we're doing. That's why we're here.
I so appreciate you saying that. I think that's the key idea, that like this crisis is an opportunity to live a better, more abundant life, to be in deeper relationship with our neighbors and the natural environment in which we live, to act in accordance with our deepest held values, and to build economic systems that regenerate the earth and create a beautiful, prosperous, integrated human society with Mother Earth. And so I think that's the vision I want to leave with people here, and just say, get involved, follow us on Twitter. Let us know if there's anything that we can help you with. We'd love to make introductions and connect the dots for people in this space. And yeah, looking forward to seeing this podcast unfold and what all the stuff we're going to learn. This is awesome.
Yeah. It's not going to be easy, but this is where we are. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Sweet. Thanks, man.
Thank you.